So I'm going to be presenting about 12 or 13 slides that are going to cover the theory from the FAU, the Federación Anarquista Uruguaya. And each slide's going to have bullet points. I'm going to read through them and just sort of riff off of that and add some things that came up in the last time that I did this presentation, as well as other things that I can connect to kindergarten and to the Center for Especifismo Studies in particular. These come from a text by Julian Lopez called now I lost the title. It's the intertextuality and the oh, here we go. I've got it here. The Uruguayan Anarchist Federation and the Intertextual Production of Latin American Anarchism. So like I said before, this is going to be a pretty dense presentation. So I'm going to try to present the whole thing together, and then we'll be able to go back and ask questions afterward. So to get started, the theory, according to the FAU, is something that's come up already in kindergarten a lot. It's essentially a tool. So theory like we've talked about in kindergarten, theoretical unity consists of tools, and these tools are validated through political practice. So they're not just inherently good, they prove themselves to be useful in this certain kind of practice. So that's not even just any kind of practice, we're talking about political practice. So there's a kind of falsifiability to these tools. They're not just valid because they're valid. The political practice that becomes a space for producing theory because of this. So without having political practice, you don't have a context from which to be producing the theory. You're only producing tools that you think will be good, but they don't inherently have a targeted use. And so that means that political practice is an important basis for even why theory is being produced. So that brings us to effective and relevant political practice as dependent on theory of concrete reality. So this isn't just theory of things in general. This is distinctly not just philosophy, right? It's not a theory that's useful in all contexts, in all times, and all places. This is theory of concrete reality, meaning the actual situation that's experienced, the actual thing happening right now. So we can conclude in Especifismo that theory is a tool for the social and political work of an organization. So we use the example here. This is a quote from Julian Lopez's text, but with the quote from Huerta Grande from the FAU in the middle here. I translated this myself so that we had a specific reference that was going to be more useful, and I'll talk about that after I read it. So the image used by the FAU to explain the role of theory is that of any tool used for work. Anyone who buys a new chainsaw and instead of using it for work, spends his time bragging about it, isn't really doing anything. He's all talk. The same goes for those who could have a new chainsaw and benefit from it, but prefer to do it by hand, because that's the way it was done in the past. Huerta Grande, FAU, 1972. The former makes theory a mere intellectual concern, while the latter rejects it out of hand. So what I'm talking about here is I used I translated this as chainsaw because I think it's an easy tool for us to understand how we could do it by hand with a handsaw, and someone could be very proud of how they do it by hand or how they've done it by hand in the past. And that could become a reason why you're unwilling to adopt a new tool and use that instead and give up on a tool that you used before. But someone could also be very into how they bought a new chainsaw and it's so great and it costs a lot of money and it's really shiny and it does all these fancy things, and maybe they don't even know how to use it, and maybe they don't ever use it. And that starts to be a different kind of problem but they're both related to mistreating theory as a tool, not treating it as a tool that's actually relevant to practice, but just a tool that has some kind of value in itself. This brings us to the next point here, which is FAU's reevaluation of ideology. So this isn't just their definition of it, but it's distinctly a kind of understanding ideology differently than has been done in the past. And what we could think about these other uses of the tool, they're what we might call ideological understandings of tools. They're not theoretical in the way that FAU means it. So for the FAU, ideology is not false consciousness, delusion, or deception. This is important because a lot of times in several Marxist tendencies, this is a common way to understand ideology. It's something that confuses us. It tricks us into thinking we have interests that we don't, working towards ends that are not actually in our interest, and in that way, leading our movements to be co-opted. But for the FAU, the traditional Marxist understanding doesn't really recognize the agency or collective will of social movements or of individual actors in those social movements. By this, what we're talking about is that it assumes that ideology is something that's always given to people by the context, that the conditions, that the dominant system is always what's furnishing the characteristics and content of ideology. But for the FAU, that's not the case. So distinctly, we talked about theory as a tool. So if we say theory consists of conceptual instruments to understand reality, this is what makes it equivalent to a kind of science because it's falsifiable. It makes hypotheses about relationships. It tests them in practice. It modifies those hypotheses, and it continues to refine and improve over time. That's different than the understanding of ideology, which consists of values, perceptions, ideas, feelings, hopes, desires, and so on. Distinctly, these are non-scientific, but in order for them to be relevant, they require commitment. And I think that's the way to understand what we say here by the traditional Marxist understanding doesn't really have a place for agency or collective will in the formation of ideology. So ideology gives meaning to the practice. If theory is a tool that's useful for that practice, ideology is the thing that's giving meaning to that practice. It's what lets us know that that practice is something we want to be doing and fits with our values and our long-term objectives. Ideology produces and reproduces reality. So again, theory is trying to understand reality, but it's ideology producing and reproducing that reality. And I think that is part of where the traditional Marxist understanding could conflate reality or could conflate ideology and theory. It's by the way that ideology produces and reproduces reality that makes it seem as if we could influence how reality is produced theoretically. And we start to collapse those two into one thing. So some critiques from the FAU include the critique of scientific interpretations that are coming from Marxism. So this specifically is talking about this idea of kind of discovering a correct strategic path, deciphering it in some kind of a scientific method, as if strategy is a thing to be able to see clearly and not a creative endeavor requiring commitment and interpretation. It's also the collapsing of theory and ideology into one thing, so that theory is no longer trying to test itself and be as accurate and as relevant to practice as possible, but instead, the theory is valued just because it's ideologically important. And the other way around too. So the actual content of the values and principles and long-term objectives is determined theoretically, not through our actual commitment to those values. There's a critique of historical materialism. And here we're talking about this idea of phases of history, or that the potential for revolutionary rupture is strictly determined by the conditions surrounding struggle. and not by the agency and active participants in that struggle. And likewise, this is they have a critique of Kropotkin's evolutionism, which is the idea that maybe we don't need a distinct rupture per se, but what we need is to change ourselves and change our movements and change our culture over time, so that revolution is not as much about struggling to break free from capitalism, and it's more about struggling to instill our own practices and values. So the FAU has a critique of this, emphasizing that we have to go through a rupture, through a break, through a conflict with capitalism. Here's another quote from Julian Lopez. Socialism, revolution, or anarchy are not for the FAU moments of a linear historical movement that a historical science has discovered and aims to stimulate. On the contrary, they are aspirations that can be realized or not according to the advance of the political struggle that depends intimately on theory and ideology. So here, what we're saying is that the potential for revolution, for this rupture that we're talking about, is not something that's determined by conditions. It's something that either we accomplish because it's an objective we've been able to articulate collectively and strive and work toward and be committed to, or it's something we fail at trying to do or never actually make into a goal that we're trying to achieve. It's not something that will strictly be determined by the conditions. And the conditions won't in themselves improve our ability or our commitment to these projects. So the FAU is specifically working from a post-colonial perspective. This is important, and we'll kind of distinguish here a little bit what might be meant by post-colonial in this context rather than decolonial. I think that might be clear as we move through this part of the presentation. So this consists of critically dismantling the conception of Latin American thought. So trying to understand what this means, and in a really, let's say, like open to new interpretations kind of a way. So this relates to something that's seeing Latin America as more than just something that's self-defined, meaning like it's not something that they're choosing to see themselves as entirely, or that the definition is entirely up to the people who inhabit this territory or who are given this label. There's a kind of it being given to them, but also that what they're studying and attempting to question here is not just an object that exists ontologically. That means like we're not talking about philosophy here. We're not trying to pick out Latin America as a kind of entity that exists in all context universally in humanity. It's a distinctly situated subject, a distinctly situated thing to consider. And that again goes back to, like we talked about, theory. In order to understand concrete reality, we need theory of that concrete reality. We can't just assume that we know because we're using the right terms that we're talking about the correct thing theoretically. That starts to be more ideological than falsifiable. So it's less scientific and less theoretical. So they're looking at this as more than self-defined, ontologically, not just an ontologically stable object, and it's disconnected from European modernity, but it's not entirely disconnected. And this is the important part, because it's an identity marked by intellectual colonialism. Again, this is an identity that is not just of their own making, but at the same time is not entirely someone else's. So Latin American social agency is itself something they see as a process that is open-ended, not some preformed identity, meaning the identity is itself, not only does it not have clear boundaries, but that it is a process. It is a name for a process, not the name for a fixed label. It's not the name for a fixed territory. It's not the name for a fixed kind of culture or a fixed kind of political practice. Instead, it itself is a term to be battled for. The meaning of it is there to dispute. And again, to go back to the ideology, it's ideology that gives the meaning to that. So this post-colonial perspective is also consists of reflections on how social movements produce theory within and from Latin America. So thinking again about the theory produced in context, this is about the theory that's coming specifically out of Latin America, but distinctly out of social movements in Latin America. So how that theory is being produced from there and within those movements. So this relates to liberatory political discourse in Latin America, which itself was marked by ideological expressions from the European proletariat. So the workers' movement, the socialist movement, the anarchist movement, these all have connections from the very beginning to the same kinds of movements happening in Europe. And I think this is an important thing to think of, not just like in a colonial sense, which I think is also what's meant here with the idea of the post-colonial perspective, is that the revolutionary movement itself is something that is spreading, and it's not spreading through colonial methods, it's spreading through methods of solidarity and seeing struggles that are the same and share the same final objectives, share the same antagonists. So, like we learned in the last presentation about the history of the FAU, in Uruguay, there was a delegation that was part of the original IWA, the International Workers Association. And so from the beginning, like it says here, they were in dialogue with revolutionary efforts in Europe. They wanted to know about them. And this, I think, is important here as we say dialogue. This isn't just a one direction thing, right? It is going in both directions where the movement in multiple continents, the struggle in multiple continents, is able to learn from each other and from different manifestations and different articulations of that struggle. Latin America it had a Latin American focus without a distinct break from European thought. So this I think is also part of this post-colonial perspective where there's not a need to throw away the European the tools of European theory, yet it's entirely trying to focus those tools and use them and refine them and improve them from the context of Latin America. So it's assuming the existence of European modernity that has spread globally, but it's rejecting the conclusion that everything somehow fits inside of that modernity. So just because that has spread doesn't mean it encompasses everything and that it encompasses every possibility. So Latin America begins to be seen as this kind of object that is theorized as distinctly exterior, or as we might call in a different context, like peripheral, right? So this is not peripheral or exterior in the relation of a global hegemon or something like that. This has to do with exterior in the sense that it's not part of the source of these ideas, but it is connected to the history of those ideas. So theoretical production, according to the FAU, consists of theory being the fruit of complex interactions, but these interactions are permeated by power. They're not just interactions that, and again, this is because again, theory is attempting to understand concrete reality. Concrete reality is something that has resulted through power struggles, and so theory is not something that happens without a kind of power struggle of its own. And this means that just attempting to articulate theory is not something that the powers that be, let's say, are going to do on behalf of revolutionary struggles. It's something that has to come from these movements themselves. I think that that's also what's meant here by the fruit of these complex interactions. It does have to do with commitment to these interactions over time. But this is about creating new formulations that dialogue with and adapt to the context. This could be both the context in Latin America, like we're speaking about from the FAU, but also the context as it relates to specific locales or specific organizations that we're doing social work inside of. And here, I think, is really the important part about how, like I was saying before, with Latin America as a kind of exteriority, what's happening here in this theoretical production, or like we say in kindergarten, that theory has to be like homemade. It needs to be like brewed in house. This same kind of thing goes with this next point here about it being mutated expressions of anarchism and Marxism. This isn't about trying to take them and ideologically revalidating them. It's attempt to take these things that are tools and practices and refine them by combining them with our commitment to our ideology and our proficiency with a certain set of tools in order to accomplish these long-term objectives of libertarian socialism. So these are connected to the cultural and political environment of Latin American social struggles, the same way the workers' movement and the socialist movement were created to were connected to struggles happening in workplaces. These cultural and political contexts in Latin American social struggles are what produces and what has produced this theory that we're studying in kindergarten and that does have purchase, like has relevance, is able to gain traction in other parts of the world as well. So just to overview the theory from the FAU, it's not born out of nothing. It has a certain distinct past and lineage and uh, uh, history to how it got to where it is. It's never closed and finished. Just like science, just like any other hypothetical projection, it's looking to improve. And in that way, it's both something we're using in the moment because it's the most educated conclusions we can produce, and it's something we're looking to improve and looking to be critical of the limitations of the tool we're using. And so in order to do that, it can't be self-absorbed. So this is not just a kind of ideological point that it's not entirely self-absorbed. That theory needs to be tested in the real world in order to be better. It needs to be tested in order for us to know that it has a kind of scientific value, and it's not just the things we want to hear or want to say. So this brings us to the next thing that we're going to discuss here, which is kind of almost to the end, is intertextuality, which connects us to kindergarten and how we read social anarchism and organization every year. The text is itself, when we study this, a kind of site that we go to. We use the metaphor of a path on a trail that's going out to a cabin in the woods, and that kindergarten is us moving through that path closer and closer to the cabin, where there's a lot in that cabin, but we also can't just bring it out of there. And so in that way, someone has to do the work to get themselves to the cabin, and we can do a lot of work to help anyone willing to put in the time and the commitment to get there. But we can't just take everything out. And that doesn't mean we don't try to take more out, right? We try to share as much as possible, which is part of how we've developed the 104 steps. It's through us trying to figure out how can we teach people how to take the trail, right? How can we get more people through the trail? How can we train more people so that they can even be guides on that trail? How can we revisit this every time and still have something we're learning and not just kind of going through the motions? So that relates to this quote here from, again, from the Julian Lopez, this idea that the word or the text is a conjunction of words, of texts, in which at least one other word or text is read. Every text is constructed as a mosaic of quotations. every text is absorption and transformation of another text. So this is very explicitly what we're doing with like the 104 steps, right? We've taken this text that we've read and revisited so much together as a kind of meeting place, and we've turned it into a kind of map that helps us be on the same page as far as how we understand how to go through that larger text. And that both of those texts, and we see this also in social anarchism and organization, and in specifically the chapter 15 that we started with, a lot of that text is just references to other texts. It's itself a kind of can of worms that tries to be as explicit, like we said before, that theory doesn't just start from anywhere. It's coming, it has a certain path, past, it has a certain history that's led it to be developed and articulated in the way it is. A lot of that is what's going on with this kind of citing sources, right? It's not about an academic rigor. It's about a militant rigor and an attempt to recognize both what came before and be responsible explicitly for what we're adding and how we're mutating and transforming. So the theoretical potential of intertextuality is related to the situatedness of producing a text. A text is written at some time in some place by some people. It doesn't just come from nowhere. And so there is an aspect to the environment in which that text is produced and the participants, the active agents that were part of making it happen. There's a deep and multi-layered dialogue of a text. This goes for both literary and theoretical texts, meaning that these ideas don't just come out of nowhere. They're in dialogue with ideas that already do exist also. And I think that this goes back to what we were saying before about the Latin American political discourse, is that it was in dialogue with the revolutionary efforts in Europe and always has been. And in that way, it's not just attempting to analyze its own struggle, but learn from other comrades and other people's struggles that are not immediately the same thing, but they're not necessarily so different that through dialogue there can't be new connections made. That relates to, I think, the depth that could be reached through analyzing what's going on in other places. This situates theory historically and socially. This is kind of like I said before, the context of what's happening, but also the idea that like theory isn't just this permanently valuable thing. Just like any other piece of technology, it's impressive until it's not impressive anymore. And so I think that there's an aspect to theory that if we situate it historically and socially, it helps us understand it more, but it does kind of take away the shiny sheen of it, right? It doesn't turn it doesn't let it just keep being this pristine object that we think is valuable always and forever. Um, and finally, the intertextuality highlights the interactions that are making it possible. So a text, again, is connected to other texts. And as much as it attempts to isolate itself and sit by itself, it's almost even just more dependent on readers to come in and connect it to other things. If it's not making itself explicit in how it's connected to other things, that doesn't mean it's any less connected or that there's any less interactions. So intertextuality is about like the same way when we read a step in kindergarten and someone can say, this reminds me of this idea from this other book that I've read. That is us insisting on the intertextuality of a text, that the text doesn't have to say this for us to bring it into there. So this is related to the double dialogue of a text between those who write and those who read. So that's one dialogue here, right? We're between writers and readers. And so in kindergarten, we take very seriously our role as readers, that the text isn't just there and it's written. We're trying to learn how to read it closer. We're trying to profit from this reading in particular. And we're trying to, what we say a lot of times is do a reading, not just read, but do a reading, which a lot of times for us as an organization has meant produce something that goes along with our reading, whether that's notes, whether that's new writings that go along with it, whether it's the 104 steps. We're attempting to leave some kind of trace to the fact that we read this. And so this is the one dialogue, writers and readers. The double dialogue, though, is also between the text itself and its context. So the text is not just an isolated object, the same as we talked about. Latin America is not just an isolated object. This is not a philosophical, ontological study of text. This is an attempt to understand that this text is an articulation of agency of actors in a context attempting to accomplish something. If we see all of this as a result of will, then there's so many efforts that go into a text that are not just apparent in its content, but actually need us almost to, like I said before, either bring them to the table or awaken them from within that through discussion and dialogue of our own. So this is the last slide here. And it relates to methodological difficulties that are produced by all this, right? All of this grandiose ideas about theory don't come without challenges. And so essentially what we could think about these is that through this way of understanding theory and ideology and political practice, the FAU and with Especifismo, we choose to take on certain methodological difficulties over other difficulties that we might be encountering as an organization. So this specifically relates to how to write the theoretical proposal of an organization and not of just one person in the organization, not just a single individual. Um, this is obviously a challenge that anybody who has ever tried to produce a text as a group or in an organization has experienced. If you've ever had to even just do group work in school, this is not something that just is simply resolved. And that's, I think, what we mean by difficulties here. These are challenges that we don't just come up with one structural or organizational or democratic resolution for how we're going to deal with this, because it won't be something that's just resolved for good. It is a kind of inherent challenge of this methodological predicament we're deciding to place ourselves in. This is about understanding the internal tensions in an organization and not attempting to resolve them through just a procedure that could be decided and put in place in a kind of cold, sterile sense. It's avoiding perspectives from above. So again, even if we're just to decide this democratically, through actually attempting to produce theory in context, that theory is not just using someone's voice. It doesn't mean it's using the voice of the context either, right? That would be dogmatic for us to assume, oh, we have some really good theory. It's really representative of reality. But it's not just that we can produce some kind of procedure that guarantees everyone got the right fraction of input here. We really do have to assume that we're working somewhere in a gray area that we can't resolve altogether. And so accepting that challenge and the responsibilities that come with it, I think is a big part of the militancy of producing theory. And then finally, prioritizing the collective voice. And this is something we try to do in kindergarten in the Center for Especifismo Studies in the different texts that we produce. They are attempting to speak with what we call three factors. One factor is from the participants, from the discussion, from the conversation. So that would go from a certain session of kindergarten, for example. Then the second factor is the militants from the Center for Especifismo Studies who participate in producing the text, so doing the writing. In this case, this is both the writers, but it's also the readers of the notes and of the dialogues that came out of the discussion. And then the third factor is the voice of the international current of Especifismo, which is something that no one person gets to speak on behalf of or as the representative of, but that we're attempting to recognize is the context of our ideas and uh, of the theory that we're producing. So this emphasis on the collective voice for us has both a mixture of the most international level, the most concrete level of participants, and then a level of militants who are actually doing the work to sift through this and produce it, or turn it, transform it, mutate it into something that is an enduring production itself, a text someone else can encounter.